When we think of the Cuban Revolution, we usually picture this straightforward story, right? Good guys kicking out a bad dictator. But the real story, it's a lot messier. Because the revolution didn't just take down old enemies, it actually created new ones from inside its own ranks. And the wild part? Its very first opponents were the same people who'd been fighting for freedom in Cuba for decades.
And that brings us to the real question we're digging into here. It's a question that gets to the heart of so many revolutions. When does a revolution start to, devour its own? The story of Cuba's anarchists is this incredible, almost forgotten cautionary tale. It's all about what happens when that fight for freedom ends up creating a new kind of power, one that can be just as ruthless as the old one.
So this is the paradox right here, laid out plain and simple. On the left, you see the revolutionaries. What do? They fought dictators, organized workers, demanded freedom. Okay, now look at the right, the so-called counter-revolutionaries. They fought dictators, organized workers, and demanded freedom. See what's going on? It's the exact same list. These weren't different groups, they were the same people. So how in the world did an ally become an enemy, seemingly overnight?
All right, to really get this, we've got to go back in time. We need to understand who these people actually were. Because, the anarchist movement in Cuba wasn't just some random fringe group that popped up in the 50s. Nope, they were a serious, powerful political force. And they had deep, deep roots in Cuba's long fight for liberty.
I mean, look at this timeline. Right from the 1880s, when their ideas first landed in Cuba, these guys were all about organizing. They led the very first May Day celebration on the island back in 1890, a huge act of defiance against Spanish rule. Fast forward to 1925, and they're key players in founding the National Confederation of Cuban Workers. They survived one dictatorship, regrouped, and then, come the 1950s, where are they? Right on the front lines, fighting against Batista. So this was never just some abstract philosophy for them. This was a hands-on, century-long fight.
And get this, they weren't alone. Just look at this map. It's from their newspaper, Tierra, and it shows their whole international network. They had partner publications all over the place. The US, Mexico, Argentina, Spain. They were plugged into a global conversation about labor, about liberty. So what happened in Cuba wasn't just some local argument. It was a clash of big ideas with roots all over the world.
So, all that history, that century of struggle, it all leads us right here to the 1950s. This is the moment. The anarchists, they end up joining forces with this very charismatic young lawyer you might have heard of, Fidel Castro. And on the surface, it's this moment of incredible hope. But the warning signs, the first hints of betrayal, they started showing up almost right away.
So you might be asking, why team up with Castro at all? Well, it made sense at the time. It was a classic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. The common enemy was the brutal dictator Batista. So many anarchists joined Castro's 26th of July movement and other rebel groups. The thinking was, let's get rid of this guy, and then we can finally build the free society we've been fighting for all this time.
But here's the thing. Even as they were fighting alongside him, they had their doubts. And this quote, wow, it's honestly chilling how spot on it is. This is from an anarchist pamphlet written in 1956. That's 3 years before Castro even won. They said they had reservations about this movement and its caudillo, its leader, and his unmeasured desire for power. They saw it. They saw the strongman tendencies, the hunger for control. So yeah, they fought with him, but they went in with their eyes wide open. And it didn't take long for those fears to come true. This one event, which got the nickname the Melon Congress, was really the first huge betrayal. It's 1959, the revolution has just triumphed, and Castro himself literally marches into the Workers' Confederation Congress and demands unity. And unity was just a code word. It meant completely tearing down the independent labor unions, the very ones the anarchists had spent almost 100 years building, and forcing them all under the control of his party and the communists. That's where the Melon nickname comes from. Green on the outside for Castro's movement, but red on the inside for the communists. Just like that, decades of worker power, gone. Okay, so after the Melon Congress, that was pretty much it. There was no going back. The lines in the sand were drawn.
For the anarchists, this wasn't some minor political tiff. No, this was a complete betrayal of everything the revolution was supposed to be about. And they decided we can't be quiet about this anymore.
So what do? In 1960, they dropped this Declaration of Principles. And it was basically a direct challenge to everything Castro was building. They said, we attack the state in all its forms. We demand that workers, not the government, control industry. They rejected all the nationalism and militarism, and they flat out condemned the authoritarian tendencies they saw taking over the revolution. It was, for all intents and purposes, a public declaration of ideological.
And you can see here just how far apart they were. I mean, look at this. The anarchist vision, worker self-management. Castro's, state control of the economy. Anarchists wanted federalism, power spread out. Castro wanted centralized, single-party rule. The anarchists were against having a standing army. Castro was putting a gun in everyone's hands. It was a head-on collision between two completely different ideas for what Cuba should become.
And then things got personal. This is where the story gets really painful. This man, Manuel Gaona Souza, had been a leader in the anarchist movement, a respected figure. But as Castro's regime started cracking down, arresting anarchists, persecuting them, Gaona flipped. He switched sides, and he published this document which the Cuban government then spread all over the world, basically calling his old friends liars and traitors. And in it, he makes the unbelievable claim, I guarantee that there is not a single libertarian comrade detained or persecuted for their ideas. He's saying this while his former comrades, people he knew, were literally being locked up.
So what could possibly trigger a betrayal like that? Well, it all came down to this number. $2,088. That's it. That's how much money other anarchist groups, like the one in New York, had raised to help the families of the Cubans who were being thrown in jail. Just a small act of solidarity. But the state, with Gaona's help, twisted it. They used this tiny amount of money as proof of some big foreign conspiracy, and that became the public excuse to go after them with everything they had.
At this point, it was basically over for them inside Cuba. Their newspapers were shut down, their groups were outlawed, their members were either in prison, in hiding, or fleeing. The fight for Cuban anarchism had to go into exile. But their struggle to keep their ideas, and just as importantly, their story alive, that was far from over. So let's just recap. Why did they break so completely with the revolution they helped win? Well, from where they stood, Castro had completely hijacked it. He'd wiped out the independent labor movement they'd spent a century building. He got rid of freedom of the press, freedom of association. He built a police state with networks of informants on every block. He sucked up all the economic and political power into the hands of the state. For them, it was simple. The revolution didn't free them, it just gave them a new boss, the state. And I think this quote from Abelardo Iglesias, one of the anarchists in exile, just sums it up perfectly. He said, to expropriate capitalist enterprises and hand them to the workers and technicians, this is a revolution. To convert them into state monopolies where the producer's only right is to obey, this is counter-revolution. I mean, for them, it really was that black and white.
And so from exile, from places like New York and Miami, they formed a new group, the Cuban Libertarian Movement, or MLCE. And for decades, they just kept fighting. They published little newspapers and bulletins, basically waging a war of memory against the giant propaganda machine of the Cuban state. They just worked relentlessly to make sure their side of the story of the revolution's first enemies, didn't just get completely erased.
Which brings us all the way back to where we started, to that central question. The story of Cuba's anarchists really forces us to confront that uncomfortable, timeless question about power itself. And what their story suggests is that maybe, just maybe, the biggest threat to a revolution isn't the old enemy you defeated. Maybe it's the new power you build, the authoritarianism that can sprout from within, devouring its own children in the name of unity and control.